particular generational type. Now in our book, what we did is we talked about pop culture and how that illustrates what a generation is like. So I'm sure most, maybe relatively young audience, do you recognize who this individual is? Will Rogers. Okay, so he was kind of like an icon of that particular generation. In our book, we talked a lot about TV sitcoms. Well, TV didn't exist when this generation was coming along, so we had to talk about radio instead. And I can't imagine that any of you will know who these people are. That was a radio drama / sitcom, which eventually went on to television for a few years once television came along. But these are the people from One Man's Family. That was the name of that particular show. And that was illustrative of the kind of upbringing this was, a kind of a stern father and mother. The children were obedient, very thoughtful, didn't fight back a whole lot. There was drama, but it really wasn't an outgoing kind of group of people. When the silence, the next generational type, however, was one that I think a lot of us are much more familiar with. And this is a type of generation that we refer to, and Strauss and Howe referred to, as an idealist generation. The most recent example of an idealist generation were the baby boomers. Baby boomers in this country were born from 1946 to 1964. They were indulged as children. You know, the war was over, we had won, we were going to let the kids kind of explore their way through the world, find out how to make their way through the world, let them kind of experiment, see how things were, and come up with their own ways of achieving things. And so if you look at TV sitcoms, an example of this was Leave It to Beaver. Now think about how Beaver was reared by Ward and June. Beaver was allowed to kind of fend his way through the world. He never really got into big trouble, but he got into trouble from time to time. And Ward would always say, well, you know, boys will be boys. He's going to make mistakes, but he'll be okay in the end. So we'll kind of let Beaver and Wally just fend their way through the world, and everything will be fine. And they can develop their own values. They can learn how to do things. They can learn how to accomplish things. Well, that all went well for a while until suddenly Beaver morphed into Meathead. And what ended up happening at that point was that he had all these values, he had all these beliefs, and Ward, or in this case Archie, was surprised that those weren't his values, those weren't his beliefs. And so you ended up having these kind of conflicts, the consistent fighting between Archie and Meathead, or Mike Stivic, his son-in-law, fighting over everything, race relations, gender relations, politics, you name it, they were fighting over it. And that's what ended up happening. An idealist generation is driven by these deeply held values. When they become older, when they become adults, they are driven by deeply held values that they picked up as they were coming of age, as they were children. Now, the baby boomers are an interesting generation. We think of them as a traditionally liberal generation because at least part of the generation, maybe half of it, was involved in activities like the anti-Vietnam War activities, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, things of this sort. And so their kind of public image is one of being a liberal generation. Half of the generation was indeed a liberal generation. The other half was not a liberal generation. And maybe a better picture or thought about how the baby boomers were politically. Most of you, I'm sure, will remember the kind of iconic picture of taken immediately after the shootings at Kent State during the anti-Vietnam War rallies, when there's a picture of a young woman kneeling over the body of a classmate who had been slain by the Ohio National Guard. That part was half of the generation. That was representative of the liberal half of the generation, but the other half was the National Guard. It was behind the gun. And so you had this generation that was sharply divided. Even to this day, they remain divided. Gender gap, the whole notion of a gender gap. Men voting one way, women voting the other way. Baby boomer phenomenon. Millennials aren't like that. The GI generation before them wasn't like that. It's a very different kind of thing. And it's remained divided to this day. And so consequently, when they're running things politically, think of political examples, the Clintons, both Hillary and Bill on one hand, Newt Gingrich, George W. Bush on the other hand. They're all baby boomers. And when you think about it, they're idealist maybe ideological is a better term. They fight with each other, they're divided with each other, and we have 40 years of gridlock when the baby boomers or an idealist generation is running things. The next type of generation is a relatively small generation called a recessive generation, or in this instance, the most recent incarnation is Generation X. Generation X in this country was born from 1965 to 1981. And this was the first kind of unprotected generation. Parents very often were not at home when Gen Xers came home from school. The whole notion of latchkey kids hadn't existed in the past. Maybe Gen X kids on average had 15, 20 minutes of quote unquote quality FaceTime with their parents, one or the other, both of them together in any day. They were again unprotected, highly criticized. This was the generation that came along at the time of the pill, of Roe v. Wade. So a lot of people decided not to have children. If they did decide to have children, they had children later. A lot of single parenting. And so it's a very different kind of upbringing. One of the candidates for national office this year is a Gen Xer, and that's Sarah Palin. And she is a very classic Gen Xer, because you can see there's a bit of alienation from societal institutions that characterize this generation. They're risk-taking, both she and her husband Todd. I mean, that's kind of their life. They live kind of physical risks, going from job to job, college to college, always trying to be kind of entrepreneurial, pragmatic adults. That's the way this generation tends to behave, and it is the bridge generation between the boomers on the one hand and the next kind of generation that comes along. If you look at it in sitcom terms, the Bundy family on Married with Children, again, a typical example. The mother and father don't really like each other very much. They're constantly fighting with each other. They have no respect for one another. And the two children are kind of alienated, always kind of fighting, never quite fitting into the world, but somehow you think they're going to muddle through. Well, when the Bundys grew up, they became friends. And again, think about the relationships of the people in Friends. You don't know what their jobs are going to be. They have different jobs. They're constantly moving from job to job. Never really know what their relationships are going to be with one another. Sometimes they're in love with one another. Sometimes they're in love with other people. You just don't know what's going to happen with them. They're going through life as kind of an alienated, isolated kind of generation.